Good evening and welcome to Behind the Headlines. Today is Wednesday, the 31st of March, 2021. And in this programme tonight, we'll be discussing, are we witnessing a rise of lawlessness in our society, particularly in light of the big violent protests that we've seen in Bristol last week, but we've also seen the big BLM and Antifa riots and demonstrations across the states last summer. So big question for tonight's programme, is our society heading towards lawlessness as prophesied in the Bible by Jesus himself? Regan, it's great that we're doing a programme together, particularly on this issue, because in one of the hallmarks, I think, of COVID-19 has been suppressing people's individual civil liberties and freedoms, that people have been locked up for months and we're still pretty much under curfew now. And then some sort of sparks this unprecedented wave of anger and hatred and mob rule on our streets that we've seen in this country and, of course, across the Atlantic as well.
Yeah, so going back to right before we were actually put into lockdown, I expressed to a few people around me that I was concerned that some of the actions being taken leading to lockdown were short-sighted and could potentially lead to such unrest. I believe my words to a couple of people were that if the government wasn't careful in how it laid out certain laws and restrictions, they could have riots on their hands by the summer. And indeed, that's exactly what we saw. Initially, totally unrelated to lockdown. You're right, if we go to the situation there in Minnesota, Minneapolis, George Floyd, we have a cop who he acts in an atrocious way, a horrible way. He behaves in a way, regardless, some people look at Floyd's background or whatever, regardless of that, no excuses for how the cop behaved. We see George Floyd die, and this kicks off a wave of upset. An understandable wave of upset, because in fairness, it's not just George Floyd. We had many stories of police overreaction, police brutality. There's been mistrust of the police in the United States for some time. And there's a sense in which, observing it, you can say, well, sometimes people are a bit trigger happy. The police there are often armed and they can be a bit trigger happy. And it's just like this, compiled with the pandemic and the restrictions, just put everything over a tipping point. And that lit up not just Minneapolis, it went across really much of the Western world. It came to London. We had some protests were peaceful, but there were actually quite a few protests that were anything but peaceful. And so in responding to lawless actions on the part of the police, there were also acts of lawlessness that were committed.
I mean, firstly, I think we have to state that it has given opportunity for society to really think and address the issue of kind of race and race relations, which I think was important and long overdue. And this is something that needs to be addressed. Also, that the police needed to be, the police officer involved looks like he's going to face a very, very heavy sentence come July. I mean, he's probably public enemy number one in the States, and certainly the media attention will get bigger and bigger as that case draws closer. But the unprecedented violence, I mean, burning down 5 miles of the city centre in Minneapolis is absolutely horrendous, causing billions of pounds worth of damage to properties, to people's livelihoods. We then saw in the States a big call to defund the police. And as we'll look later on the programme, that is having dire consequences. That 20 US states have adopted, US cities have adopted this mantra of defunding the police. which we know is not a good idea.
No.
Yeah, there have to be reforms within the police force where rogue police officers behave atrociously, and they should be dealt with. But there's no excuse for this mad, senseless violence that we've seen. And we've also seen it last week with Kill the Bill movement in Bristol.
Yeah.
Where literally police cars have been set on fire. We've seen protesters actually launch fireworks at horses, incredible damage done to property. I think according to our notes here that 20 police officers were injured and 2 seriously, and 7 arrests were made. And they're calling now for a national weekend of action over this Easter bank holiday. And so what we're really seeing, I think, in our society is the rise of that lawlessness, because lawlessness expresses itself in attacking those who are in authority. In other words, it's the police that implement the laws and keep the laws, so therefore let's target the police in the most horrific way. And once you start to do that, we start to get anarchy and we start to get lawlessness.
Well, lawlessness, by definition, you're not governed by any law. You don't believe it applies to you. You engage in anarchy. You behave irresponsibly. And what we've seen, especially if you look in our own immediate context here in the United Kingdom, a very concerning bill has been put forward that we'll be looking at in just a minute, that there's justifiable concerns over. But the response to something that we perceive as lawless and against our constitutional makeup in the United Kingdom should not be to meet something that we consider to be lawless democratically with lawlessness. It doesn't make the point. Anarchy doesn't make the point that we need to have the freedom to protest, that we need to have freedom of speech, we need to have the ability to go out on the streets and make particular points.
Like you did this week.
Exactly. We have to have that ability to petition our legislature. We have to have the ability to preach in public, to evangelize and have outreaches and pray in public. And yet there are actions being taken to give the police more powers to subjectively shut down anything that they deem slightly disruptive or that they deem as a protest of sorts. It doesn't have to be a protest. It can be anything that they find slightly disruptive in the public setting. If you go to what was happening across the United States, one thing that comes up again and again is this attempt to set up autonomous zones. So last year, following the incident with George Floyd, there was a space of time. It was not particularly well publicized, where there was an autonomous zone. They referred to it by an acronym CHAZ in Seattle. And essentially, there was no law. There were no police. There were reports of sexual violence and assault that occurred there. It was, open season in regard to drugs and all manner of things where it was okay in that autonomous zone. It was a place of lawlessness. We've seen the same set up in Minneapolis. In various other parts, we've seen attempts to kind of behave in this way where it's not making the point that we're against racism. It's not about being against racism. It's about taking a valid point that can be made and can be brought to the forefront of discussion and can be brought to debating, dialoguing table, hijacking it, basically presenting yourself as supporting that and using what is a message that can be heard, that needs to be presented and heard and discussed in a reasonable way, and just blowing it to the point that you legitimize your own acts of evil.
I mean, for example, take the 1960s civil rights movement, led by the great Reverend Martin Luther King, was able to change an entire nation through his peaceful protests and didn't use violence at all. And I think that is testimony to how you can change democracy, how you can change social ills in society, not by becoming lawless. Just to remind you, we are live, we are interactive, and this program is not the same without you guys. So please send in your emails or send in your text messages into the program. And tonight's question is, are we heading towards a lawless society as prophesied in Jesus himself in Matthew 24, but also then in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 as well, with the revealing of the man of lawlessness?
We've had millions of people unable to see family and friends due to COVID-19 restrictions. We've had people locked inside. I've known people mentally well on the verge of psychosis, increased paranoia and everything. Conspiracy theories abound that can drive people to acts of sedition and anarchy. And in all of that, as we've gone through this stop-start mode of reopening society, it shouldn't be a surprise that people are on edge. It shouldn't come as any surprise that there would be deep social unrest. There are legitimate concerns, a lot of actions that have been taken in this time. Powers granted to the state outside of the norms of democracy, powers granted to the police outside of the norm, even using private security organizations to support the police, things that really go against our very real sense of freedom and go against our concepts of justice and righteousness. And so you can understand the upset in people wanting to push back, but when many of these laws that have been introduced temporarily begin
like the Coronavirus Act 2020.
Exactly. Temporary, but they keep being extended.
And this one's had an extra 6 months extension,
Exactly.
which essentially gives the government unprecedented power, gives it executive power, the largest power grab in peacetime. Never in living memory has an acting government taken so much personal power onto itself. And if you want to know more about this, you have to watch next week's Politics Today.
And pushing through, good plug there, pushing through all of these things, but also trying to normalize some of the supposed emergency laws. So this week you mentioned the demonstration I was involved in, very small, legal, lawful, within the COVID regulations, initiative that looks at how DIY abortions have been allowed in this time. A pills by post system has been allowed. They're now looking at normalizing that, making DIY at home pills by post abortion the norm, and it would become the norm. It's essentially deregulation to a very large degree of the abortion industry. In practical terms, it's decriminalization in everything but name. So that's something that people can be rightly upset about, and it shows, okay, we're told emergency procedure, this won't continue, now it's continuing. We're told the police are given limited powers in this time, nothing beyond this time, that will all change, but now they're being given more powers. So distrust is going to be there, but you don't respond to that distrust by going out, firing off fireworks at police horses, injuring over 20 police officers, setting alight various, a police van I saw was alight, smashing out the windows and everything in Bristol. That's not how the point is made. And for Christians, if there's a temptation, if you think, no, that we should be angry. Yeah, we should be angry, right? These things anger me. I've gone a lot on record in this time as to some of the stuff that angers me about the last year and how many people have just been left, in some cases, arguably to die. Mental health issues last week, children, there was the Associated Press released a study that shows particularly children have been struggling in immense ways in their mental health during this lockdown. The anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. the scriptures call us to be angry. We are to be angry sometimes. It would be wrong if you weren't angry about some of this stuff. Be angry and do not sin. And sometimes it's getting the balance, right? Okay, how can we be angry and not sin? Well, certainly this lawlessness is sinful.
Absolutely. Let's go to two excellent CBN news reports that look at some of the race riots that we saw across the United States last year and some of the disturbing groups behind these movements, in particular their calls to defund the police force in the United States.
Tear gas, tossing Bibles into fires, and burning the American flag. Just the latest from nightly riots that have drawn thousands to this city park in front of Portland's federal courthouse. Some say they're just protesting for racial justice. Others want to defund the police nationwide. Windows were smashed, buildings defaced, and fires burned nightly around the courthouse. But Portland Mayor and Police Commissioner Ted Wheeler ignored the conduct, even joining the protesters in calling for federal police to leave the area.
The reason I'm here tonight is to stand with you no matter what. I stand with you.
So we've seen lots of different kinds of makeshift weapons out here. Shields, baseball bats, tennis rackets, green lasers, frozen water bottles, glass bottles, things like that. So the protesters beat on the doors of the federal building over here for about 10 minutes, essentially begging the cops to come out. The cops finally obliged, came out and pushed everybody back. And now it's kind of a standoff. We'll see where it goes from here. While many of the signs call for the police to be defunded or abolished, it's clear their intentions are not to increase personal freedom. Antifa agitators could be seen blocking roads and trying to limit the freedom of the press.
Film the cops, not the protesters. Film the cops, not the protesters.
When a black Trump supporter was discovered in the crowd, protesters immediately called in the mob.
I have his Instagram right here. We have your Instagram up.
It was abundantly clear most of those protesting want to become the police, not abolish them. Some local Christians have been trying to be positive in the midst of these riots.
As a leader, I'm often asked to speak. And during this entire period, I've said, I just want to listen. I have trouble with people who set fires on purpose, for people who write graffiti all over the place and stuff like that, who bash in windows and loot stores. I have a real problem with all of that. But that's why inside I'm saying, Lord, you've got to help me understand what that person sees that I don't.
Tensions eased somewhat over the weekend as federal agents were replaced by Portland police officers who must follow much more restrictive rules of engagement. But that didn't stop protesters from burning American flags and even Bibles. How that relates to racial justice wasn't immediately clear. But Pastor Hennessy says there is a role for Christians to play.
We need to pray for the ability to listen, to learn, and to find out how God wants us to engage.
From Portland, Oregon, I'm Chuck Holton for CBN News.
Go home. That was the message to protesters turned violent in major cities across America. In Atlanta, Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms denounced the violence, saying black-owned businesses are being destroyed.
This is not in the spirit of Martin Luther King Jr. This is chaos.
You're being ordered to disperse.
National Guard troops were called up in major U.S. cities where protests turned violent over the weekend. Often along with police, they fired tear gas in places like Detroit and even in Oklahoma City. Rubber bullets were also used to disperse crowds. In Washington, D.C., crowds of protesters outside the White House pushed back on barricades, forcing the Secret Service to keep President Trump in a secure area of the mansion for nearly an hour. Some of the protesters set fires, smashed and burned police cars. Others looted stores, carrying away items like jewelry and guitars. Officials say many of the violent people arrested are outsiders, not local protesters, who are using the situation to create chaos in America's cities.
There are instigators that are erupting in this violence, and it reflects on black people.
On Face the Nation Sunday, Atlanta's mayor said she doesn't know specifically who is behind the violence in her city, but they are not Atlanta-based.
it looked differently racially in our city than our normal protests looked, and it was a different group. So we don't know who they were, but many of them were not locally based, I'll say that.
The administration accusing the left-wing Antifa, an anarchist group based in Oregon. Attorney General William Barr named Antifa in a statement, and President Trump tweeted that the U.S. will designate Antifa a terrorist organization. However, other officials like the mayor of Minneapolis point to white supremacist groups. Meanwhile, in Minneapolis, where the police torture death of George Floyd sparked the nationwide protests and rioting, terrorism of another kind. Horror on wheels as a tanker truck barreled toward protesters on a closed highway.
It's been awesome seeing the community come out, taking a moment of silence for George Floyd. And you just see a semi-truck come barreling through, trying to kill people, and I don't understand.
Miraculously, there were no injuries reported. The truck driver was taken into police custody. Some acts of kindness were seen during several peaceful protests on Sunday, like this Florida state trooper in riot gear, hugging a woman who thanked him for putting his safety on the line to restore law and order. Meanwhile, Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison has taken over the case against the police officers. One has been charged with third-degree murder, and they're considering charges against the three others. Gary Lane, CBN News.
We have some emails here. We have from Joyce. People seem to be less understanding of certain actions and have very short fuses. Respect for people and property appears to be gone. I do think lawlessness is on the rise and awareness of God's laws is sadly missing. And you're right there, Joyce, indeed. If we have a lack of awareness of God's laws, how are we going to be able to, in the first place, love God? And how can we even expect people to love one another? This is the city of Minneapolis replaced many police officers with what they called community negotiators. Even BBC's Newsnight reported this has been a disaster with a big rise in crime and gang murders. That's from Johnny. From Anita, evening, Simon and Regan. It's always lovely to see you both, and this is a real problem. I remember being shocked by the riots in Croydon some years ago. I was born there and worked there in my teens. The changes are very disturbing. This rise in violence has been coming for some time. Even in Jesus' time, the zealots chose violence. And we can remember that one of Jesus' disciples, who was called an apostle, Simon, was a zealot. These guys would literally hood up and wear daggers to go and assassinate. This rise in violence has been coming for some time. I've studied Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, and I know which I prefer. There's a definite rise in lawlessness, though, and it is frightening. The UK is one of the most dangerous countries in the world now. We're seeing more and more violence towards the police. The pen is mightier than the sword, and God's word is our sword. We can be angry in a constructive way, prayer and peaceful protest, or petitions.
Amen to that. So just a reminder, we are live, we are interactive tonight. So I'd love to know your views and your comments. Are we heading towards a lawless state, a state of lawlessness, essentially? And also, what's so interesting about these COVID-19 times is that it raises a very important question that I think all of us in civil society need to answer, including our government and our media. And that is, what is the right balance between the rule of law and protecting civil liberties? And, this is a very topical, but also such an important question that we all need to ask. And hopefully we'll go some way in asking that question tonight. I mean, done a bit of research on this one this afternoon, and what seems to be behind the Kill the Bill movement. Now, that is such a play on words. Initially, I thought, when I heard in the news and I was reading reports about Kill the Bill, I thought that this was an extreme, they probably are an extreme left-wing mob or organisation that wanted to attack the police. And then I discovered that it's actually this proposed legislation by the government in terms of policing and law and order, that is what they wanted to kill. So they wanted to stop this bill. But the language they use, the slogan they use, "Kill the bill," has a kind of double meaning. So firstly, it shows zero respect for the police, but also then shows their supporters that this is something that they want to rally behind. And anyone who decides to throw fireworks at police horses, to attack the police in such a way, to burn police vehicles, to vandalize shops and create an atmosphere of chaos and mayhem and destruction, that is not healthy. It's the wrong way to go about. Maybe they have a few legitimate concerns, but that's not how you do it.
So what really has brought this to the attention, and the bill that we're talking about is called the Police Crime Sentencing in Courts bill. It is 300 pages long. It's a massive tome, and particularly following the tragic abduction and murder of Sarah Everard, the activities of Metropolitan Police against protesters, a vigil at Clapham Common, were called into question. Now, there's a few things that have to be considered here. Even just yesterday and today, there's been the news that after an inquiry and investigation, the police have been found to have not acted beyond reason. But the pictures, the video footage does not lie. It doesn't look good. They didn't do anything to de-escalate a rapidly escalating situation. It also didn't help that the man who's charged with the murder of Sarah Everard is, has been a policeman, serving policeman.
High up in the Met.
Exactly.
High up in the Met.
Exactly.
But also, I think the reason why the police came into so much criticism for this is primarily because it's a vigil. With women being scared to kind of walk the streets of London, felt that that Sarah could be one of them. So they wanted to gather in Clapham Common to mark this occasion. So it was a peaceful vigil. Yep. When we had violent demonstrations, either through the support of Black Lives Matter, Extinction Rebellion, the police did nothing and allowed that violence to continue and not step in. And then there's a peaceful vigil, and then they step in. So wrong tactics, but also their concerns about COVID-19. I mean, you can be upset about something, you want to demonstrate something, but when everyone else is told you've got to stay at home because of COVID-19, you can't see your family because of COVID-19, you can't travel across the country between COVID-19, and then they think they can get together as a group and say, we care about the issue, we're not thinking about the health considerations involved for the elderly, essentially. And so therefore puts the police in a very difficult position, because the government is telling them, let's clamp down on the protesters, because under the Coronavirus Act, the government has the power to do that and the police have the power to do that. But the question is, a little bit of diligence, a little bit of sussing up the situation will realise that this would be a PR disaster for the police, and it has been. But this is what has also put a spotlight on the government's legislation when it comes to policing and crime and sentencing. I'm just going to read now some of the key things in this policy. So this is a 300-page document. It also only covers policing in England and Wales. Scotland have their own jurisdiction. It will introduce harsher penalties for serious crime, ends a policy of early prison release for some offenders, prevents unauthorised encampments, and it gives police greater power when it comes to stopping protests. And there's also that if you damage or destroy monuments, you could face a 10-year prison sentence as well. So these people are very concerned because I think even, there's a good quote from our Home Secretary here, Priti Patel, who says, in recent years, we have seen a significant change of protest tactics, with protesters exploiting gaps in law, which has led to disproportionate amounts of disruption. Speaking in front of Parliament last week, she pointed specifically to tactics used by Extinct Rebellion climate change protesters to block trains and shut down cities. So we're seeing that these protesters, extreme protesters, are not actually playing by the rules. They're not coordinating with the police. And Extinct Rebellion protesters actually closed our printing press so that the Conservative papers such as the Mail, the Sun newspaper, the Times, the Telegraph, couldn't actually get their newspapers to print for the next day. And that's a fundamental attack on freedom of the press, which is an important and key component of any democracy.
On the issue of the vigil and why some people were particularly upset, we go back a year, and we have at the time of the Sarah Everard vigil compared with the time of the BLM protests in London, the rates are either comparable or lower in regard to COVID during the time of the Sarah Everard vigil, and there were far fewer people. The Sarah Everard vigil was broken up. People are, we have really bad pictures of women being chained up, put on the floor
Handcuffs, yeah.
in handcuffs. And then, we go back and we see many, many more thousands of people. And so I can see why some would be upset more over the Sarah Everard thing, why one allowed and why not. We have here, this is from Ken. Hi, Simon and Regan. Thanks for a great program as always. Is it true that the BLM is in fact a Marxist movement dedicated to anarchy and is behind the defund the police chants? It's time these people were exposed for what they are by the authorities. Now, that's a great question, Ken. This is the movement Black Lives Matter. We need to specify that the slogan, the phrase, Black Lives Matter, do Black Lives Matter? Absolutely. Can I support Black Lives Matter as an organization? No, I can't. Why? Well, for many reasons, but here's one. This is the BLM co-founder, Patrice Cullors. We actually do have an ideological frame. Myself and Alicia Garza, the other founder, in particular, we're trained organizers. We are trained Marxists. We are super versed on ideological theories. Also, Hank Newsom, a BLM activist, in 2020 said, if this country doesn't give us what we want, then we will burn down this system and replace it. All right? And I could be speaking figuratively. I could be speaking literally. It's a matter of interpretation. I just want black liberation, black sovereignty by any means necessary. So I think that answers your question there, Ken. It is concerning. We have this as well from Les. Les has highlighted 2 Thessalonians 2:3. Do not let anyone deceive you in any way, for that day will not come until the rebellion occurs and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the man doomed to destruction. And his comment is the first rebellion involved Satan and the angels that rebelled with him. In the end times, not surprising if lawlessness and rebellion increases until that battle of Armageddon.
Absolutely. So just to let you know that earlier today, I did an interview with Pastor Jeff Quozo. He's the UK director of Behold Israel Ministries, but he's also a pastor in Bath that's very close to Bristol. So let's have a look at this interview as we discuss the rise of lawlessness. And it's great that we can be joined now by Pastor Jeff Quozo, who is the UK director of Behold Israel, as well as a pastor at a Calvary Chapel Church in Bath. Jeff, warm welcome to Behind the Headlines.
Hey, good to be with you, Simon, as always.
Excellent. And it's great to see your background, that you're one of these very few people who've got a chance to be in Jerusalem for Passover and Easter.
Yeah, wishful thinking, right? Yeah, it's if we can't be there actually, at least virtually, I'm trying to spend some time there in Jerusalem.
And Jeff, you're one of the, I think, perfect people to ask really about what's happening, in particular this rise of lawlessness that we're seeing in both in the UK and also across the Atlantic in the United States. Yeah, I mean, you're a pastor in Bath, and we see that these awful violent demonstrations that have been targeting the police by Kill the Bill protesters. Essentially, they've been launching fireworks at police horses, including setting alight police vans and even defecating on the streets next to the police. What is your interpretation of these events we've seen in Bristol?
Well, Simon, what we have seen, I believe, is we've seen protests. I think actually the day before that protest, there was a very large protest for an annual, or rather an international kind of alliance for people who were just not wanting to be locked down anymore. And it was very peaceful all throughout London. Thousands and thousands showed up. That didn't get any mainstream media coverage, which I found curious in light of the fact that the very next day there was this violent protest that then was given tremendous media attention. So it was just a curious dichotomy when it came to which things were covered and which things weren't when it came to protests.
No, which is extremely interesting. But considering that you pastor a church in Bath and Bristol's only the kind of next city away, we're very close to each other. Isn't this very kind of troubling for Bristol? The fact that you can have a peaceful protest, but once you actually have a protest that actually is designed to target the police, then this is extremely troubling.
No, you're absolutely right. There's no question it's a concern when you're putting the police in harm's way, when a mob kind of rule where people are out of control. Yeah, there's nothing right about that for sure. I think what would maybe be better is if there was that feeling, that sense that the people are being heard and listened to, then I think that helps when it comes to alleviating some of the tensions that are happening within the different communities. And so, yeah, there's nothing good about a violent mob for sure. But at the same time, it's also good to know that the people need to be heard.
Absolutely. And do you think there's a link between the coronavirus pandemic and the national lockdowns that we've all experienced here in Britain, and of course America has, and so has virtually the rest of the world, and this outpouring of anger and violence that we've seen, particularly over the summer in the States, but also here in the UK?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's hard not to make the correlation when you've put a lot of people into a place of containment for such a period of time, feeling like many lives have been adversely impacted in all different ways. People losing jobs and families being separated and losing loved ones and not being able to be with them and all the things that have been taking place. There's a lot of frustration. There's a lot of confusion. There is clearly some anger as well that's rising up, and that's where it feels like there's a need to address some of these realities so that people can feel like they're being heard without it having to turn violent.
Absolutely. And we see in your native country last summer with the horrible murder of George Floyd in police custody that sparked those huge race riots across the United States. And in Minneapolis, for example, a 5 mile of the city center was completely burnt down, completely destroyed, causing billions of pounds worth of dollars to actually restore. And yet, I think what we're seeing is pretty much unprecedented. There's such an outpouring of violence and anger. Yes, the police have a lot to answer for, but there is no behavior that justifies destroying entire cities.
I mean, I think you've said it there. There's no that one wrong does not, make two wrongs make it a right. It's just making it worse. Really, it just continues to make the whole problem grow even exponentially worse. And that's what I think, saw across the states in this summer. Is again, if there's a real issue that needs to be addressed, it needs to be addressed in lawful means. And I think this is what we're seeing when you talk about lawlessness. We're not seeing lawful things being done. It's just literally we do what feels good to us, and we tell you what to do by way of, again, a mob kind of society.
And Jeff, we know that according to scriptures, whether it's in Matthew 24 or 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, the Bible talks very clearly about in the last days, one of the key indicators will be a rise of lawlessness. Do you think we are now seeing the lawlessness as mentioned in the Bible?
Simon, I think you're spot on, my friend, because what we're watching unfold is exactly what you said. Second Thessalonians chapter 2 tells us that the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. And sure enough, we are living in a society these days where there is this spiritual vacuum, where the morality of society has broken down. And it's really been replaced with a secularism, which says there is no God. And secularism, because there's no God, leads to really a selfism that says it's all about me, myself, and I. It's about what I want, which then in turn leads to hedonism. And with hedonism, now you have people basically getting rid of the old laws, because the old laws talk about marriage and family and society, laws that held the society together. Well, we got to get rid of that stuff because I want to do whatever I want. And then that creates a breakdown of society, and we're watching that kind of lawlessness starting to abound more and more, preparing the way. As you said, it's a spirit of Antichrist, which is leading us to a place where ultimately there will be the rise of the lawless one.
Absolutely. So, how much do you think that the far, or I should say, actually extreme left-wing organizations such as Antifa are behind this? We also see that Black Lives Matter has been hijacked by a extreme left-wing Marxist agenda that wants to overthrow the state, wants to overthrow our capitalist system, essentially wants to dismantle the nuclear family. These ideas are having traction in these COVID-19s, which looks like it's in fulfillment of biblical prophecy. What are your
Yeah,
thoughts?
again, as you said, I mean, the BLM movement is a Marxist movement that they make no bones about it. That's very clear as you read their material. And so with that comes this concept that equality is the overriding god of the day in terms of everyone needs to get what's equal. It's a communist mentality, which we understand, though, at the same time, is what we've always seen with that kind of system. There's always going to be inequality. There's the those who are more prominent will get the power, will get the privilege, while it kind of puts everybody else on this quote unquote equal plane. And we're kind of watching that happen. And people think it's a good thing, especially this next generation who's not terribly familiar with history. They just think, oh yeah, equality, everybody gets the same. That sounds good, but there's a sting in the tail.
Absolutely. And how much do you think the church, both in our nation, also in the United States, needs to wake up as we're seeing that this huge rise in lawlessness that is taking place across our two nations and also across the whole of kind of Western Europe as well?
Well, yes, as you point out, there is a need to wake up, because Jesus himself told us this would be a sign of the times. In Matthew 24, he said, and lawlessness will abound. And what we're watching, as I said already, that the mystery of lawlessness is at work, which tells us we're getting close. Israel's back in the land in fulfillment of prophecy. Like, we are getting to these last days that the Bible talks about. And that means it's time to be looking up, because Jesus is coming back soon for his church. And with that understanding, what we realize is that this lawlessness, as it's abounding, he says that the love of many will grow cold. And that's what we're seeing, because when people start to believe they're living in a society where they're not protected, they can't be sure that the government's going to take care of them because there's a sense of lawlessness abounding, people are going to look out for themselves. And there's going to be this anger and this opposition, and things will get worse and worse as they feel and sense that lawlessness, the laws aren't being upheld, and they feel at risk.
Absolutely, which leads me on to a very important question is, as Christians, how do we prepare ourselves spiritually to stand in these exciting but difficult days, as we know that the approaching of the Lord Jesus Christ is increasingly at hand?
Well, Jesus said, well, we know that Jesus is the light of the world, right? Well, he also said to you and me, we are the light of the world. What does that mean? It means that actually we're not the source of the light. We are to be reflecting the light in a dark world, similar to how the moon works at night. It's not a source of light. It reflects the sun to a dark world. And so too, and especially as we're having this full moon right this minute, we're seeing that in its fullness. That same idea, you and I are to be a reflection to the world. We're supposed to shine the light of Jesus to a dark world so people can see the truth. We're not to be asleep. We're to be awake in these days. As believers, we're not to be in the dark, we're to be in the light. And so we want to walk in the light, and we want to know what's going on by way of following the scriptures. We want to look to the word of God to be that lamp to our feet, that light to our path.
Amen. And finally, Jeff, what message do you have for those Christians who don't actually believe that we're living in the last days and don't really believe that the book of Revelation, for example, is literal and there's no such thing as a literal antichrist? Because this is the great danger, that we can be blind about these current events that we're living in.
Yeah, and well, I mean, I think we see the reality that there's the handwriting is on the wall, and that would be what I would say. Jesus talks about the signs of the times, and I have to be honest, every single prophecy that Jesus gave or that came, that he has said has come to pass. And just even an example, I quoted Matthew 24. He told us not one stone would be standing upon another. Well, today we have a pile of stones that have been unearthed down there at the bottom of the Temple Mount, showing us that prophecy came to pass. Well, Jesus gave a whole bunch of other prophecies, and he talked about the fact that the tribulation, if you're a believer in Jesus Christ, you have to listen to the words of Jesus. And being God, he said that there's a tribulation coming that's worse than anything this world has ever seen. That's a judgment that is real. And so he is, if we're listening to the word of God, we're listening to Jesus, then we need to take his words, at face value and understand that we need to be heeding that warning.
Excellent. Well, Jeff, thank you so much for joining us on Behind the Headlines. Your contribution, as always, is excellent and first class, and we really appreciate the time that you've given us today.
Good to be with you, Simon. God bless, my friend.
God bless.
Thank you to our viewers for all of your interactions and texts. We have this one, I believe, anonymously. Our government has authorized people to pound on your door and demand to come in. It goes on to describe a neighbor who's terrified. Even without COVID, she feels her home not safe because of persons shouting and threatening her and saying that they were government enumerators and would gain access and interrogate her. And she's 82 years old. And indeed, okay, we come across elderly people who themselves are treated in a horrifically disrespectful way. We can look lawlessness scripturally, disobedient to parents, disrespectful of elders. That fits right in with that.
Also reflects a growing coldness of people's hearts and attitudes towards one another. And we're certainly seeing a breakdown in community, that's for sure.
We have this from IJ in Manchester. Good evening, gentlemen. You are both doing a great job as always. Unfortunately, we have a problem, and the problem is not just of lawlessness, but is a problem of sin and rebellion against God. You just look at what is happening now. Other religions have countries where they've designated Holy Land to their gods, and Christians now have none due to compromise and political correctness. The UK, known as a Christian nation, now sits on the fence. God help us. Also, people seem to be exploiting slogans to their own evil ends. Take Black Lives Matter, for instance. Let's pray for the fear of God to be restored in our nation. That is the only answer. Indeed, we do need the fear of the Lord. It's the fear of the Lord that's the beginning of wisdom. And that sort of fear that recognizes where we're at in wrong relationship with God will bring us to that fear that we have, that when we're in right relationship with God is one of worship, awe, and reverence. Now, looking at some of what's happened again in Minneapolis, there was a memorial that was set up to George Floyd. Some of the stuff that's been happening in relation to that, though, has been rather disturbing.
It's a no police zone as well.
Yeah.
So effectively, they've set up this area where he was killed by that police officer, and what they've decided to do is set up a no police zone with devastating consequences, and the area's become literally lawlessness.
Well, earlier this month, a 30-year-old volunteer at this memorial was shot dead, and cars with broken windows line the streets of that. And business owners say customers have fled and emergency services refuse to come in. Now, if that's not the most self-defeating thing, I don't know what is. Sam Willis, the owner of Just Turkey Restaurant, says, I call that the United States, and he gestures beyond the barrier that's there that separates that autonomous zone from the United States, basically. Over here, this is an area, Sam Willis says, where there is lawlessness. This so-called autonomous zone was originally supported by Minneapolis as a progressive city council. Last June, a majority of councilors vowed to dismantle the city's police department and later cut $8 million from its budget and diverted it to other services in a knee-jerk reaction to protests over Mr. Floyd's death. There is a response that's right. That's not it.
Yeah, but also what's interesting as well, that more than 100 police officers actually left the police force last year, double the usual number, and dozens more were on leave with post-traumatic stress caused by the violent protests that we saw in Minneapolis last year. And this one guy said that even the ambulances can't go into this area anymore, and they have to drive them to the hospital. So we see complete anarchy, we see complete lawlessness as people are starting to question now, was defunding the police a bad idea? I mean, at the time when emotions are rising really high, it seems like this is the most popular thing to do, but the consequences have been absolutely devastating in terms of law and order. And now the Minneapolis City Council are having to go on a multi-million-pound fundraising drive to recruit more police officers. So we see here that actually in practice, this is not working very well. And of course, we have George Floyd's trial that's due to start, the inquiry and the trial into his death is due to start in July. And that could spark even more riots and racial tensions. But it just shows you, in these times we're living in, we are living so close to the end that we're seeing this huge rise in lawlessness, as Jesus described himself in Matthew 24. We're going to see very soon the rise of the man of lawlessness, known as the Antichrist, to become the one world leader who absolutely hates God and hates his laws. And we're already seeing that breakdown of society, I think, shown through the cracks caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, I think, has accelerated everything. And of course, what we've done is we've moved away from God being at the center. We've moved away from our Judeo-Christian heritage with the biblical laws in place that govern a society. And, it's righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach. And currently, our Western nations they're in a mess.
Oh, absolutely. It's a complicated scenario that we have here where, we're supposed to respect the authorities that we've been given. We're supposed to recognize that they are a terror to evil, not to good actions. And yet sometimes the authorities that are there are acting outside of their authority. They are a terror to those who are doing good in some cases. And yet at the same time, the reaction to that cannot be evil. It cannot be unrighteous itself. Heather has a good point. Jeff, who was, I believe, the pastor of the church who was speaking in one of the CBN video clips, made a good point. When people are not listened to, that leads to violent protests. Those in authority should be more aware of what people are going through during COVID-19, i.e. under house arrest and solitary confinement. So yeah, absolutely. People need to have that understanding. It goes both ways.
There is no excuse for lawlessness.
No excuse for lawlessness.
Well, I think we've had a great
for the police or for us.
Yeah, I think we've had a great program tonight, because it's important that we show indicators, particularly where we are prophetically. And in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, it's not surprising that we're seeing this spirit of lawlessness arise in our nations, particularly in the Western world. And this is a key indicator that Jesus Christ is coming back soon. So this gives us an opportunity to get our hearts ready for his return, because that's what it's all about. So I want to thank you for watching tonight's edition of Behind the Headlines, and we'll see you the same time next week. Thank you for watching Behind the Headlines.